Explain they rode on into the mountains, and their way took them through high pine forests, wind in the trees, lonely bird calls, the shoeless mules slaloming through the dry grass and pine needles. In the blue coulees on the north slopes narrow, tailings of old snow, they rode up switchback straw. A lonely aspen would where the fallen leaves lay like golden displays in the damp black trail. The leaves shifted in a million spangles down the pale corridors, and Glanton took one and turned it like a tiny fan by its stem, and held it, and let it fall, and its perfection was not lost on him. They rode through a narrow draw where the leaves were shingled up in ice, and they crossed a high saddle at sunset where wild doves were rocketing down the wind and passing through the gap a few feet off the ground, veering wildly among the ponies and dropping off down into the blue gulf below. They rode on into a dark fir forest, the little Spanish pony sucking at the thin air. And just at dusk, as Glanton's horse was clambering over a fallen log, a lean, blonde bear rose up out of the swale on the far side where it had been feeding and looked down at them with dim pig's eyes. Glanton's horse reared, and Glanton flattened himself along the horse's shoulder and drew his pistol. One of the Delawares was next behind him, and the horse he rode was falling backward, and he was trying to turn it, beating it about the head with his bald fist, and the bear's long muzzle swung toward them in a stunned articulation. Amazed beyond reckoning, some full gobbet dangling from its jaws and its chops dyed red with blood. Glanton fired. The ball struck Bear in the chest, and the bear leaned with a strange moan and seized the Delaware and lifted him from the horse. Glanton fired again into the thick ruff of fur forward of the bear's shoulder as it turned, and the man dangling from the bear's jaws looked down at them cheek and jowl with the brute and one arm about its neck like some crazed defector in a gesture of all through the woods a bedlam of shouts and the whack of men beating the screaming horses into submission. Glanton cocked the pistol a third time as the bear swung with Indian dangling from its mouth like a doll and passed over him in a sea of honey-colored, hair smeared with blood, and a reek of carrion, and the rooty smell of the creature itself. The shot rose and rose, a small core of metal scurrying toward the distant beltways of matter grinding New Teletow, the west above them all. Several rifle shots rang out, and the beast loped horribly into Thephorist with his hostage, and was lost among the darkening trees. The Delawares trailed the animal 3 days, while the party moved on. The first day they followed Blood, and they saw Elve, where the thing had rested, and where the wounds had stanched in. The next day they followed the drag marks, through the duff of a high forest floor, and the day after they followed only the faintest trace across a high stone mesa, and then nothing. They cut for sign until dark, and they slept on the naked flints, and the next day they rose and looked out in all that wild and stony country to the north. The bear had carried off their kinsmen like some fabled storybook beast, and the land had swallowed them up beyond all ransom or reprieve. They caught up their horses and turned back. Nothing moved in that high wilderness save the wind. They did not speak. They were men of another time for all that they bore Christian names, and they had lived all their lives in a wilderness, as had their fathers before them. They'd learned war be warring, the generations driven from the eastern shore across a continent, from the ashes at Nadenhutton onto the prairies, and across the outlet to the Bloodlands of the west. If much in't world were mystery, the limits of that world were not. For it was without measure or bounded. There were contained within it creatures, more horrible yet, and men of other colors and beings, which no man has looked upon, and yet not alien. None of it more than were their own hearts alien in them. Whatever wilderness contained there, and whatever beasts. They cut the trail of the party early the next day, and by nightfall of the day following they had overtaken them. The lost warrior's horse stood saddled in the caballado as they had left it, and they took down the bags and divided his estate among them, and that man's name was never Sadogan. In the evening the judge came to the fire and sat with them and questioned them, and made a map upon the ground and scrutinized it. Then he arose and trotted out with his boots, and in the morning all rode on as before. Their way led now through dwarf, oak and ilex, and over a stony ground where black trees stood footed in the seams on the slopes. They rode through sunlight and high grass, and in the late afternoon they came out upon an escarpment that seemed to rim the known world. Below Theman, the paling light smoldered the plains of San Agustin, stretching away to the northeast. Theath floating off in a long curve silent under looms of smoke from the underground coal deposits, burning there 1,000 years. The horses picked their way along the rim with careened. The riders cast varied glances out upon that ancient and naked land. In the days to come they would ride up through a country where the rocks would cook the flesh from your hand, and where other than rock nothing was. They rode in a narrow enfilade, along a trail strewn with the dry round turds of goats, and they rode with their faces averted from Theric wall, and the bake of an air which it rebaited. The slant black shapes of the mounted men stenciled across the stone with the definition austere and implacable like shapes capable ovulating their covenant with the flesh that authored them and continuing autonomous. Across naked rock without reference to sun or man or God, they rode down from this country through a deep gorge, clattering over the stones, rifts of cool blue shade. In the dry sand of the arroyo floor, old bones and broken shapes of painted pottery, and, graven on the rocks above them, pictographs of horse, and cougar and turtle, and the mounted Spaniards helmeted and bucklered and contemptuous of stone and silence and time-mites up. Lodged in faults and crevices 100 feet above them were nests of straw and jet samphrum. Old high waters and the riders could hear the mutter of thunder in some nameless distance seemed. They kept watch on the narrow shape of sky overhead for any darkness of impending rain, threading the canyon's close-pressed flanks. The dry white rocks of the dead river floor round Ansmouth as arcane eggs. That night they camped in the ruins of an older culture deep in the stone mountains. A small valley with a clear run of water and good grass. Dwellings of mud and stone were walled up beneath an overhanging cliff, and the valley was traced with the work of old Zacchaeus. The loose sand in the valley floor was strewn everywhere with pieces of pottery and blackened bits off wood, and it was crossed and recrossed with the tracks of deer and other animals. The judge walked the ruins at dusk. The old rooms, still black with wood smoke, old flints and broken pottery among the ashes and small dry corn cobs. A few rotting wooden ladders yet leaned against the dwelling walls. He roamed through the ruinous kivas, picking up small artifacts, and he sat upon a high wall and sketched in his book until the light failed. The moon rose full over the canyon, and there was stark silence in the little valley. It may be it was their own shadows kept the coyotes from abroad, for there was no sound of them, or wind, or bird in that place, but only the light rill of water running over the sand in the dark below. There, the judge all day had made small forays among the rocks of the gorge, through which they'd passed, and now at the fire he spread part of a wagon sheet on the ground, and was sorting out his finds and arranging them before him. In his lap he held the leather ledger book, and he took a peach piece, flint, or potsherd, or tool of bone, and deftly sketched it into the book. He sketched with a practiced ease, and there was no wrinkling of that bald brow, or pursing of those oddly childish lips. His fingers traced the impression of old willow wicker on a piece of pottery clay, and he put this into his book with nice shadings and economy of pencil strokes. He is a draftsman, as he is other things, well sufficient to the task. He looks up from time to time at the fire, or at his companions in arms, or at the night beyond. Lastly, he set before him the footpiece from a suit of armor hammered out in a shop in Toledo 3 centuries before, a small steel tubadero frail and shelled with rot. This the judge sketched in profile and in perspective, citing dimensions in his neat script, making marginal notes. Glanton watched him. When he had done, he took up the little footguard and turned it in his shand, and studied it again, and then he crushed it into a ball of foil and pitched it into the fire. He gathered up the other artifacts and cast them also into the fire, and he shook out the wagon sheet and folded it away among his possibles together with the notebook. Then he sat with his hands cupped in his lap, and he seemed much satisfied with the world, as if his counsel had been sought at its creation.